Welcome to Freddy's Huge Ask Podcast. Huge lives and the stories behind them. And now here's your host, Freddy Cruz.
Critically acclaimed author Daniel Bergner explores the world of mental illness and medications through a personal account of his brother's experience with a bipolar diagnosis. His new book is The Mind and the Moon, My Brother's Story, The Science of Our Brains and the Search for Our Psyches. And Daniel joins the show right now. Hello.
Hello, it's great to be talking with you.
Yeah, I'd love to begin the conversation with something I've never really put two and two together in my 46 some odd years on this planet. That's understanding the difference between the mind and the brain. So let's begin there.
Let's begin there. It's an important question. So I think if we go back, and we'll touch on this later, to the beginning of my brother's story in the early 80s, we were convinced the mind and the brain were really the same thing. Here's this physical organ, the stuff of the self. I think that's emerged slowly not to be at all true. That was tremendous scientific optimism. So one of the fascinating things for me on this journey was spending time with preeminent neuroscientists, brain researchers, and they were consistently saying two things. One, we haven't really improved on our psychiatric pharmaceutical drugs in 50 or so years. Two, think about an organ like the heart. Google this now. You'll see heart cells pumping. They're pumping. They're doing what the heart does. This is not true of the brain. It's the only organ that it's deeply not true of. Our neurons, our brain cells, are not thinking. Somehow, out of the interaction of 100 billion neurons comes thought, comes self, comes consciousness. And as this researcher into depression pointed out to me, that's a difference of so much magnitude. It's almost as if we're talking about a different entity. And so the difference between the mind and the moon, he would also say, as a quick way to encapsulate it, when I, Dr. Nestler, started out my career in the 80s, I thought psychiatry would solve psychiatric problems pretty quickly, right behind cancer researchers. Well, we're still struggling with cancer. And as he would put it, cancer is so dumb-ass simple compared with the brain and the mind.
You really touched on something there, Daniel, and that's that the brain isn't always thinking. And this is something else I've never wrapped my head around, because your brain, you might not be thinking like we are right now consciously thinking about this conversation, the words that come out of our mouths, but our brain is telling my hand, anybody watching this on Zoom, or if you're listening, I'm moving my hands and making motions. I'm holding a pen, I'm clicking it. My brain's not thinking about it unless I'm actually intentionally thinking about it. But it's also, our brain is doing so many things, like instructing our digestive system to push out whatever we had for breakfast, and telling our heart to pump the blood and to do all these things.
Yeah, a great line of questioning. So, and one can really go down, as I have these rabbit holes about consciousness, about will. How do we decide to move our hand in this way? But one of the things I'm thinking about is, one of the scientists I spent a lot of time with was really involved in trying to piece together and parse out how our brains put together what we see as real, okay? Because one of the characters in my book, there's my brother and then there's Caroline, exists in kind of two realities. Let's just say for shorthand right now. How do we arrive at our reality? Well, lots of people have just pointed to this thing we call the prefrontal cortex. We hear about it all the time, executive function, blah, blah, blah. But he was convinced, I think he's finally right, this is much, the source of this are much deeper in the brain, hippocampus, how it connects to other areas of the brain. So he's struggling with this, and it's valiant struggle, illuminating struggle. I love being with him, and I think readers will be fascinated, but it's also a struggle where he would sometimes feel tremendous resignation, precisely because it was always taking him back to this complexity, this elusiveness of the self.
Yeah, well, okay, so you bring up the struggle to determine what is reality, and That's a perfect setup to what I wanted to talk to you about with regards to a passage you write about Foucault, and I've got very little knowledge about the guy, other than there are certain people in the psychiatric world who despise him, and there are people in the political world. This is not a political discussion, but there are people in the political world and the philosophical world who absolutely hate this dude, which only intrigued my my curiosity about the guy. But you write about him in that he's got an observation or a belief that the teachings that are perpetuated by psychiatric. Okay, let me rephrase. Foucault's teachings that psychiatry's claims to rationality, now I'm reading this verbatim, are inherently deceitful because they were used as a way to stigmatize and quarantine those who might disrupt the prevailing social order. And that was decades ago. So I interpret that as humans are hierarchical control freak monsters that'll do douchey things to one another because they don't want to be uncomfortable. What is your outlook on mental health in regards to the crisis that's going on right now and this particular claim?
Okay, well, fascinating that you're citing Foucault, first of all. I would dial that back just a little bit. So Foucault's part of a set of mid 20th century thinkers who were very emphatic about society's need to over control us and who saw psychiatry as a means to do that. So the quick reference point for that is go watch One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. You'll see that at work in that movie. Let's dial that back because I spent a lot of time with neuroscientists and brain researchers who I really adored and loved learning from. I don't think they were agents of surveillance and control, at least not consciously.
Sure.
But there's some truth in what Foucault's saying. We, as a people, I think, are made nervous, fearful by difference. Certainly, we're made nervous and fearful by difference that comes along with a certain darkness. We're going to have to get to suicidality later. And in that fear, we want to control. So this just goes back to my parents. Forget society, though I think that is an important force here. My dad and mom, our dad and mom wanted nothing more than what every dad and mom wants when their child is facing a psychiatric diagnosis. They want to control it. They want to eliminate the chance of terrible outcomes. That's understandably often all they can think about. And so that leaping in to control comes into play, and in ways we can talk about, I actually don't think it's constructive.
Yeah, and I want to talk about your father being a doctor and how he was very well respected in his community. He played a huge role in shaping some policy across different cities. And so I'm wondering how his role as this well-respected physician played into your brother's journey. And again, this kind of framing of the desire for control and trying to keep the kids safe.
Right. So my dad was a physician and a public health official, a deputy director here in New York, and then director in Seattle. A couple quick examples. He really made improvements in survival rates of heart attack victims, prevented kids from falling out of windows by a very simple intervention, window guards, which we see all over the place now.
Very noble, very noble.
So all credit to him. But that kind of very rational perspective wherein one can intervene, control a situation, and come up with a better outcome, that just didn't really apply to psychiatry because we didn't really and don't really know enough about the psyche. And as a result of his desire, he sort of coerced, our parents did, my brother onto a locked ward. As a result of that desire, they really couldn't see my brother for who he was, especially as my brother kind of wrestled himself free and really had a flourishing life. I don't think they ever succeeded in seeing him in a new way. And this gets to that idea of stigma. We think that the idea of mental illness as a medical condition has removed stigma. Sometimes yes, but I'm not so sure. Certainly not in my brother's case or in Caroline's case, certainly not for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, and I'd love to ask about, because you write so much about your brother and these other individuals as well. You're following their stories, and not just these individuals and your brother, but also you, as you allude to, you spend a lot of time with these scientists and psychiatrists and whatnot. But how was the feedback or the reception from your family when you decided to write the book, and then fast forwarding to after it's done?
Right. So my brother put a tremendous amount of faith in me. And I think his reading has been really gratifying to me. If anything, has brought us closer. Same with Caroline's response. Both our parents are gone, so we didn't have that pressure. Um, so I don't know what their response would have been. I don't know if they would have seen things differently. I hope so. I don't think I gotta emphasize, I don't think they were wrong. I think they were doing what any parent would do, which is cling on and hope that things would get better. I think in the clinging and in the controlling, they actually made my brother just feel isolated.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I've read the part about the wedding and your mom and your dad, and it was painful yet beautiful at the same time. So, and I want to dance around that. I don't want to say anything further because I want people to buy the book,
Yeah.
and get the book and read for themselves just how everything shaped throughout the pages. So my next question for you would be, what made you decide to want to write about your own personal battles? Because that was, again, harrowing. And I just found myself like thinking, holy crap, you know?
So this will take us toward that subject of suicidality. I felt like I wanted to do two things. Keep it somewhat to a minimum because I'm not really naturally a confessional writer, but I wanted it in there because I feel like the subject just comes for the person who's feeling it, just a lot of shame, a feeling of failure. And that contributes to those who actually go ahead and attempt suicide. I just wanted to lift some of that. And that's exactly what Caroline does on a big scale with this innovative prevention program she has going. It's really to trust that in connecting, which I was trying to do in those pages, that one is reducing the likelihood because one is reducing isolation. I mean, I respect your avoidance of the spoilers, but let's go back to, early on in my brother's story. At one point, he just felt so lost. He got this T-shirt made saying, "I feel like I have nothing to offer," and wore this T-shirt out and around Seattle where we were living. I mean, imagine getting to that point and having to find oneself, one's way out of that. And that's really what he's been able to do. And I hope that's instructive for people.
Yeah, and it provides hope, because when you have these kinds of, when you're fighting these uphill battles, and we want to think of our parents as kind of like that cornerstone, that bedrock of support, and it's the conflict, the basis for the conflict lies within that bedrock. And so it's not easy to get out of, especially when you're going through something for decades.
Right. That parental fear, which again, we all feel it. I've certainly felt it,
Me too.
is so powerful. And I think as parents, we just have to watch out. It's not necessarily a constructive place from which to interact. Caroline would say this over and over. I mean, her parents perhaps have never completely let go of seeing her as a diagnosis, even though she's completely transcended that diagnosis in a complex way. I just want to give one emblematic example. So Caroline, who grew up with a really severe diagnosis, she still hears voices enough so that she'll sometimes ask me to repeat a question. So she exists in two realities, let's say, for simplicity's sake. And yet, just yesterday morning, we were emailing back and forth about Melville. Now, that's just a quick example that these are complicated human beings who I think we can really identify with rather than kind of corner off in our fear.
Right. And really it goes back to what kind of society do we want? Because you laid down quite a few historical anecdotes. I mean, King George III, that was mind blowing. I never had any idea. I knew he was a tyrant, but it humanizes him in ways that I never thought. Because as Americans, you and I were like, that's the bad guy, and thank goodness we got our independence from him. And you humanize him in a way that I'm like, ooh, man, okay. It really made me think. And so what kind of society do we want? Do we want to learn from these people who the collective seems to kind of shun away, and as Foucault would say, quarantine, and kind of, put those people over there in that building, in those cages, pump them with whatever medication we can give them? Or do we want to learn from them so that if we end up personally having an experience with one of these people, or if they end up in our family, how do we want to coexist with them?
That's right. And I think the third main character, David, who's really a spectacularly accomplished civil rights lawyer, he's the only one whose name I changed. He needed just that bit of privacy. He struggles with something that's very common, depression and anxiety. But it does raise the same questions, and an additional related one, which is about the quick fix. Like, at some point, his therapist said, you don't really need medication. We're making progress. Let's stay this course. He wanted a solution to what his therapist thought was rather moderate depression, went the medication route, and then decided for various reasons to go off. And his story just begs questions about something we haven't heard about much. We are hearing more and more about withdrawal symptoms from the relatively soft set of drugs, the SSRIs and the anti-anxiety medications. Again, I don't want to preach anti-medication. I don't want to shame people for taking medication, no way. But these are drugs that affect our brains in ways that then, of course, affect our minds. And I think his story, because it's so common, because he talked himself from Supreme Court litigator into believing that he was totally incompetent. Again, I think we can all find some illumination in his story.
Absolutely. And I'm looking at this stat right here from Johns Hopkins that says 26% of American adults have at least one diagnosable mental disorder in a given year. So one of the things your book does is argue persuasively against certain solutions, and understanding that you're not, this isn't something you're not like, I'm anti this or I'm pro this. You make a persuasive case against certain solutions to the problem. So how much hope do you have that we can turn the ship around, seeing as how, more than a quarter of people are going through something?
So I do have a fair amount of hope, so much so that some people have accused me of being a bit of a Pollyanna and optimist. I don't think I'm that. But let me just put this in context. So around the time of the Enlightenment, so let's say 1800-ish, just as we were forming as a country and rationally creating a system of checks and balances, psychiatry was doing the same. We were trying in various ways to rebalance the mind, to excise its areas of problems. We had spinning machines that would send more or less blood to the brain. We had drowning machines that would jolt the brain into submission and supposed cure. And that's gone on and on. Of course, we can talk about lobotomies, then we get to heavy-duty medications and the era that we're in now. Question is, for all that the Enlightenment brought us, this rational approach, this scientific approach, which again, I'm fascinated by.
Me too.
Is there another way? And so I just want to touch on two things.
Yeah.
So hardcore scientific researcher Rachel Yehuda, who I got to know a bit, researching the molecular mechanics of depression and PTSD. Nevertheless, apologized to me. She said, I'm about to go to the woo-woo. And what she meant was, I'm going to get spiritual on you. I'm going to ask you to think about completely alternative ways to consider mental health. It's not like fixing a broken leg. It's the opposite. We need to find a way to place ourselves within something larger. Could be traditional religion, could be mindfulness. But it's that sense of meaning that we might gain that might be more of a salve, of a way of addressing our mental health. Same thing from one of the key depression researchers. Same thing. He wasn't going to go to religion because he's a scientist. He wasn't going to cross that line. But he said to me, look, mindfulness, meditation, seeing yourself within some larger meaning, these things help people.
You really hit on something there. And I wonder if that's like the fundamental difference between Western societies and Eastern societies, which talk about the holistic approach, whereas you're talking about the rational, well, this is A and A needs to be fixed. So here's B. This B is the fix. But you're
Yes.
talking about these professionals who are like, well, that might be true, but why don't we also not instead of, why don't we also try this?
I think also is a key word. This is consistently being discussed. I think you're right to point to, for simplicity's sake, Eastern ways of thinking. So there's a character in the book, Chaku, who approaches things that way. I visit a really alternative house that deals with people with severe diagnoses in Israel that also takes an approach along these lines. Yes, we need, and also, given that medications don't seem to be improving and are helping some, but not enough.
Daniel, this is Freddy's Huge Ask podcast. So I would love to ask, what is your huge ask for readers of The Mind and the Moon?
Maybe it's not that big. I'd like readers, when they're done with the book, to go to my website, danielbergner.com. My email is there. Reach out. I'm interested in your thoughts. I'm already hearing the range of thoughts, and I encourage that. People who think I'm dead wrong, as well as people who are thankful for the vision I'm putting out there. I really appreciate that connection, that reader engagement.
Okay, now I've got to ask another question. From what group, if you had to lump in the people who think you're dead wrong, are they typically from the patient point of view or from the medical professional point of view?
So I wouldn't want to overstate it, but of course, this is controversial, and I'm going to get some scattered critical messages. I'd say a little bit both. So there are some patients who really feel like they've been helped, their lives have been turned around by medication, and I need to write back to them and say, I never meant, if it's a misinterpretation if you think I am writing against that. I am not. I know there's a percentage of people who have that experience. It's great. Some conventional psychiatrists have protested, but I don't think many will, because I think there is a general recognition. It goes as high as the New England Journal of Medicine that wrote about psychiatry's, they put it as identity crisis in 2019, as I was getting going with the book. World Health Organization's same message recently. We're at a turning point for sure. And I hope that I'm speaking to that turning point.
And at least you're opening the door a little bit. And for what it's worth, I read the book and I didn't get any I'm pro this or I'm anti this with regards to conventional treatments and other things at all. So you're listening to this podcast, please, please, please pick up the book. It is harrowing, it's informative. And again, Johns Hopkins says 26% of American adults have at least one diagnosable mental disorder. And Daniel, when you say there's a like an identity crisis, I mean, hello. And I don't want to see that 26% get any higher.
No, none of us do. And I think there are ways to keep that from happening.
Please go to danielbergner.com. That's Daniel, Bergner, danielbergner.com to find out more about the book, The Mind and the Moon. Daniel, thank you so much for coming by the podcast.
Thank you for a great conversation.